Guten Abend, willkommen zu unserer Diskussion beim...
Good evening, welcome to this discussion here at the Open Web. Ethical capitalism worth a try.
Economist. I'd like to welcome all of you to this incredibly interesting topic, ethical capitalism. Is it worth a try? And I think just to set the scene a bit, the last 30 years have in many ways been the triumph of capitalism. Francis Fukuyama, I think, wrote it was the end of history when the end of communism came, and it's been the triumph of the capitalist system. It's had dramatic successes. 1 billion people lifted from poverty. The share of people living on $1 a day has gone from 42% about 30 years ago in the world to about 14%. Dramatic strides in poverty alleviation. At the same time, there are big problems. You don't need me to tell you that. Inequality within countries has widened dramatically. Around 2/3 of people in the world live in countries where inequality has widened. Most of Europe, the United States, China, India, big income gaps, as we've seen the gains from growth going overwhelmingly to the top of the income distribution. We've also seen more obvious ethical challenges, whether it's cronyism, whether it's corruption, whether it's disproportionate gains to a very small group of people. So those are the kinds of subjects that I hope we're going to look at this evening, and I hope we're going to say, is there something we could do better? And if so, what? And if so, who should push it? So those are the questions I'm posing to this panel, which is a spectacularly interesting panel, people from many different walks of life to address this question. I think you have a note of who the illustrious careers of everybody on the stage, so I'm not going to go through that. It would take the next hour and a half. But just very briefly, Stan Bergman, Chairman and CEO of Henry Schein in the USA. Next to him on his left, your right, Jasmine Whitbread, Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children. Here, Peter Brabeck, Chairman of the Board of Nestlé. Mohammed Yunus, now Chairman of the Yunus Center, known to all of you as the founder of the Grameen Bank. Here we have Martin Sorrell, Chairman of WPP. In the I'm so sorry, a mere CEO. Very unimportant person, a mere CEO. And finally, Ignacio Visco, Governor of the Bank of Italy. So you have, from the economists to the businessmen to the charitable sector, all manner, all sides of this debate, if you will, represented. Stan, let's start with you. What are, in your view, the most important ethical challenges that modern capitalism faces? Are there any?
All right. Thank you, Zaini. First of all, I'm 100% committed to the notion of free markets. There's nothing inherently bad about capitalism. If we take a look at what's happened in the last 200 years, 200 years ago, 85% of the world's population was in abject poverty. Today, it's 16%. You can debate those numbers, but the trend is that way. Profit is not a dirty word. The free markets work generally, and strong economic growth can deal with practically every issue in one way or another. Having said that, capitalism is only as good as the capitalists. The bottom line is that capitalism has to be rooted in ethics. Just like doctors have to be ethical, business people have to be ethical. Just like government officials need to be ethical, business people need to be ethical. It's not the system that's the issue. It's the notion of ethics. You know, the Cardinal Turkson made a presentation on behalf of the Pope at the opening of the Davos World Economic Forum. And he said, humanity is served by wealth and not ruled by it. And I think the bottom line is so much of this ethics issue runs to that. At the end of the day, it's the constituents in society that make capitalism work or not. Business leaders have to take a long-term view. The culture of business, specifically for public companies, is short-term view. The issue is investors need to take a long-term view. They can't be short on long-term. They need to be long on long-term. The bottom line is that governments have to make sure the rules are fair, and governments need to ensure that there's a level playing field. We don't need more we do not need more government. We need good governance. The bottom line is, if investors do this, if government does this, if businesses leaders are ethical, and at the end of the day, public-private partnerships working with not-for-profits is a terrific way to balance the ethical aspects of society.
Can I just ask you, and I'm going to get to everyone else, but how would you rate your fellow businessmen then on those criteria?
Do you mean
No, I don't mean the panel. I mean broadly.
The people on the panel are great.
Okay, put it more concretely. Has business become less ethical recently, in your view?
Well, I think, over the centuries, we have seen spurts where greed has been greater than necessarily the balance of moving society along versus the profits that drive business. I think that has been the issue, and this is a cyclical situation. I believe that at the end of the early part of the 2000s, we were in a period where greed was a lot out of balance. And I think there were a lot of business people, and I would say in the financial sector. And I think government had a lot to do with allowing this greed to continue. The challenge with government at that period was that the rules were, I think, basically okay, specifically in the United States and the UK and a couple of the other developed countries. But there was a lack of oversight. So I think unchecked governance leads to greed being excessive. And I think that breeds the wrong people at the top of many companies. So I wouldn't paint all business people or the percentage of business people as greedy or being bad, but I would say that where there's a lack of governance and government oversight, this allows for these bad things to happen.
Thank you. Martin, how do you react to that? Do you agree with it?
Well, I pick up on one thing in particular that Stan talked about, and that was he mentioned the word or phrases, short-term and long-term. And I think the critical problem, and I go back to, I think, an interesting speech by John Brown, who was then CEO of BP, in 1997 at Stanford Business School, where he was a graduate of, and he went back to the university to talk to the student body, and what he said was, and I'm paraphrasing it, is that we overcomplicate, we over-sophisticate corporate sustainability, CSR issues, responsibility issues, that if we are in the business, and we certainly are at WPP, which is an advertising and marketing services company, if we are in the business of building companies, brands, products, services over the long term, we will do that in service of all the stakeholders' interests that there are. So if you're in the oil business, for example, and your basic objective is to rip out as much oil out of the soil in the quickest time at the lowest cost, you will destroy the environment. If, on the other hand, you look forward to the long term and say, I'm going to be in the business, in the oil or the energy business for the long term, I think it's the way to think about it. Now, the long-term issues, and Stan mentioned it, it's a big problem because we're all evaluated trying to run listed companies, not private companies so much, but listed companies. We're all evaluated on quarterly performance. I agree with Stan 150%. That has to change if we're going to get change in attitudes. But all the stakeholders, whether it's your employees, whether it's your customers, your suppliers, the government, NGOs, journalists, trade journalists, whatever it happens to be, will be best served if you take the long-term view. And some people call it a crisis in capitalism. The challenges that we face, which we discuss here in Davos, and we've been encouraged this year to talk about the long-term issues, inequality, the health, welfare, youth unemployment, which is scandalously high, particularly in Western Europe, in countries like Spain, where 50% of the youth are out of work. And you know that statistically, if a young person is out of work in the early part of their career, their lifetime earnings are crushed. So this has big social, political, and moral consequences in the long term. Now, the situation, and I think as to who should do something about it, business should take the responsibility. I agree with Stan that the private enterprise system works very effectively. For example, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, taking the BRICS as examples, have all benefited by the use of free market mechanisms. We can argue and debate how free those market mechanisms are, but the engineering of the middle class, of which about there are 2 billion people at the moment on this planet, and by 2030 it's estimated it will be 5 billion people. The future of the middle class is, I think, going to be determined by the long-term approach of a capitalist system. Now, we have some big challenges facing us. A lot of economists and business people have been talking about post-Lehman, September of 2008, that big financial crisis, that we've had a relative jobless recovery. That what's happened is, although the economies are recovering not rapidly, but slightly, that hasn't led to an increase in jobs. It will become much more complex because all the technological, not all the technological revolutions that are taking place, but most, increase capital inputs, but don't increase labor inputs. So it is likely that the issue of unemployment is going to become even more significant. And I think that's something that we have to address. As to the mechanisms, I think business has a responsibility, government has a responsibility, but I would posit this. Muhtar Kent, who's chairman of and CEO of Coca-Cola, is after Peter and myself, has become the chairman of the International Business Council. His initiative this year is to work through governors and mayors. 50% of the world's population live in cities. It is projected that 70% of the world's population will live in cities. The engine, the public-private engine, can be business and using state, local government, city government in a more cohesive way. So the challenges that face capitalism, and I agree with Stan, I don't think there is a better system. We don't need more planning or too much planning or more regulation. There's still too much of it. But if we get people to focus on the long term, the capitalist engine will deliver benefits for all.
Thank you. Peter, let's get your voice too, because then we've had 3 corporate voices, and pick up a little bit on what both of the first 2 speakers have said, and I'm just going to paraphrase slightly, but Stan's view was that one problem was the lack of ethics, perhaps, or the greed of the actors, of some actors. And then, Martin, you focus somewhat on the system in the sense that we have seen these developments recently of a big shift towards capital away from labor. And I would ask whether that is indeed ethical. Is a system that over the last 30 years has had such a transformation away from workers' share of national income towards profits, towards capital, ethical? Or are you more on the viewpoint of Stan that it's the ethical question is about individuals?
No, I think the whole question is, first of all, the word ethic per se is a relative word, because ethics always refer to a certain society. So when we are talking here in this room about ethic, we are talking basically about our values of a Christian, Protestant, or Catholic environment and the ethic of this. Now, if we would be sitting just today in Saudi Arabia, the ethic and the values would be completely different. That's the first thing. This is a very, very important aspect. And this is one of the reasons why we have many times such a confrontation as Western Europeans, for example, with Chinese or with Japanese or with the Muslim community, because we have different ethic ideas.
Can I just push you on that, though? Is capitalism, which did, in some sense originate, or at least the idea of capitalism, if we go back to Adam Smith, is it inherently situated in the Western ethic, if you will?
No, capitalism per se, and I think Stan was absolutely right. Capitalism is not ethic or unethical. You can make it depending on, first, how you exercise it, and secondly, into which value scheme you put it. Okay? I think that was Stan said very clearly from the beginning, and I fully agree. Now, let me come perhaps to another dimension which is mostly forgotten in discussions. It was in 1905 that the famous sociologist and philosopher Max Weber introduced 2 types of ethics in our world. So we are talking about, let's say, the Christian ethics, but he introduced 2 types. He said there is an ethic of outcome and there is an ethic of rule. It seems to me that we are basically discussing constantly about ethic of rules. We are not talking about ethic of outcome. And I give you two examples, and I know a little bit provocative. The first example is the financial crisis. That was the outcome. I think a very unethical outcome. Okay? What produced the financial crisis? It was not the individual greed. The individual greed came in much later. What really it was a political decision of the then President of the United States, our good friend, Bill Clinton, who decided that every US citizen has a right to his own house. And he gave order to the state-controlled financial institutions like Fannie Mae that a certain percentage of their mortgage loans have to go to people even if they do not have the financial backing to assume those loans. That was the subprime mortgages. What then happened is that these subprimes were then bundled and suddenly became AAA documents. So what I want to show you is the rules, the starting, was absolutely ethical, but the outcome was completely unethical. Okay? I give a second one and then I stop down. We have a big discussion on GMO. Okay? In Europe, Switzerland, Austria, my country, even more than here. Now, again, I ask you a question. On the rule side that we are against GMO, this seems to be very ethical. The outcome that every single year, hundreds of millions of children are going blind because they do not have access to sufficient vitamin A that developed technology could give them today, I think is unethical.
I'm going to resist the temptation to rise to those. It seems that the...
Stanley, can I just add one?
Yes, of course, do.
The shifting government policy. So when I graduated from university in '68, post-war Britain, the Beveridge Report, full employment was the priority of government policy. In fact, there was a thing called the Phillips curve, Professor Phillips at London School of Economics, which said, what level of inflation are we prepared to tolerate of full employment? Today, it's precisely the reverse. What we're concerned about is the level of inflation, and it's what's the level of acceptable unemployment for zero inflation. So government, I think Peter's right, government has to play a role in this and take responsibility of it, because government policy in most countries of the world, certainly in the mature countries of the world, is predicated on the evils of inflation, and that obviously has an impact.
So that again is the setting of the rules.
Yes.
Ignacio, I'm going to have to turn to you now because I think you've been, in two ways you're at the center of this. Firstly, do you agree with the idea that the ethics of the rules in finance were all absolutely fine? It was just the outcome that was unethical. And secondly, to what degree do you think the rules of capitalism more broadly are okay, and the outcome is not, or is the outcome okay too?
I think that both. There is a problem on the outcome side and there is a problem on the rule side. After the end of the Cold War, we started with a major new world of globalization, of technological change. There was a stock of innovation that was made available for civil use. Productivity was supposed to increase. Prosperity was supposed to improve, and instead, at the end, it was not delivered in the way it was expected or predicted. Clearly, there is a difference between our economies, advanced economies, and the BRICS, as it has been mentioned. The perception is a substantial increase in inequality within countries, but at the world level, inequality, in a sense, has substantially reduced. So there is a difficult read in that sense. But what we have observed with the major changes, a substantial increase in inequality, difficulty for young people to find jobs. This is the product, I would say, of a technological change which is very different from others. That basically, as it has been mentioned before, We have a substantial substitution of capital for labor, and it will take a long time. I think we need really to find ways to create jobs. There will be jobs, but we do not know where, and we cannot plan. At the same time, we had the financial crisis. The financial crisis was the result of two things, I would say. The first is excessive risk-taking, and I think it is behavior. So it is not only the rules of the game, it is actually the way people performed, and internalizing basically gains, short-term gains, and not looking at the longer term. At the same time, however, I think the rules were not set properly, and there was regulatory capture. So at the end, we have this problem. Finance has always been historically considered a morally dubious activity. Amartya Sen put it, how comes that such a useful activity has been considered so morally dubious over the centuries? Things about Jesus throwing the moneylenders out of the temple, or Solon prohibit lending in Greece, in ancient Greece, or Aristotle saying that interest is very bad, is breeding money from money, so it is unjustified and unnatural. This is a secular trend. On that, there are cyclical swings. The cyclical swings, now we are in a cyclical swing which is very much against the outcomes. But clearly, finance is fundamental for our society. Finance is part of capitalism. It's fundamental because it allows us to move resources from across space and time. In that sense, it helps growth, it helps well-being. The problem is that if it is badly regulated, and if it is not understood, so there is an education point here to stress, then it may become very dangerous. At the end, it is very difficult to define capitalism as it is difficult to define ethics. But capitalism has two arms, I'd say, at least in the way I understand it: democracy and markets. The market is an instrument, it's not the end of itself. It's a marvelous instrument, it's fundamental. Obviously, a market unregulated may lead astray, and the democracy in which at the end people really does not have an ability to influence the decisions that are taken for them is a very, very weak setup. It is imperfect, we know, but we have to improve on that. And I think what we have observed this time, differently than in the past, because in the past we had at time market failures and too much state government failures and too much state interventions, and we moved towards free markets, less regulation and so on. Then you had these excesses, and then you had market failures and you had governments intervening. This time we have had both, market failures and government failures. This is why the challenge now is so strong.
Out between them. Thank you. Jasmine, you listen to this, particularly from the corporate side. Do you think that the right problems have been identified?
Well, I mean, I'd just like to sort of go back to some of the basics here. I actually agree with a lot of what has been said. I've disagreed with some points as well. Maybe we'll come on to those. But, back to your opening question, Zanni, about, what's wrong with capitalism at the moment. I mean, I would just point out three things. I mean, I would highlight again the point you started with around inequality. I mean, every year now for the last 5, 6, 7 years, all the participants at Davos who are polled as to what their top concerns are, that rising up the agenda in that concern, it used to be sort of a concern number 5, and it's now number 1, is inequality. And that's, from some of the most powerful and wealthiest people who are coming and attending Davos. Now, I can assure you at the other end, the people that we work with at Save the Children, some of the poorest and most marginalised, vulnerable members of society at the other end of the spectrum, they're also very concerned about this. The statistic that came out, I think, from Oxfam at the beginning of this week in their report, that the wealth held by 85 of the wealthiest people in the world is equivalent to the wealth of the poorest 3.5 billion people in the world. I mean, that is enough to make all of us uneasy. That is not the building blocks for a stable, healthy, and flourishing society by any means. And now we could have a debate. I would be willing to enter into a debate about whether it's actually the inequality that's the problem, if the people at the bottom of the pile were sort of getting the basics, I think there are some things that actually run right across, no matter what society, whether you're in Saudi Arabia or North Korea or wherever you are, or in Switzerland here. Every country in the world, apart from 2, have signed up to the Universal Declaration of Rights for Children. All the countries got together to sign up to the Millennium Development Goals. Those Millennium Development Goals are off track. I mean, it is absolutely unacceptable that we have a huge problem with hunger in the world that is underlying cause of 1/3 of all the children who are dying. A child is dying right now every 4 seconds. And 1 in 3 of those children is because they're not getting enough to eat. And millions more are stunted. So it's not as if you've got kind of at the bottom, well, they're just relatively not so well off. I mean, we're talking about people living in absolute poverty. And those goals that all of our governments signed up to, right across the board, different cultures, they are off track. 3.5 of them are on track, and the others are off track. And the system is not, left to its own devices, the system isn't going to address that.
Isn't it true to say things are better than they were?
Things are definitely better than they are.
Okay, well, just let's establish that for me.
Well, I would agree with that. So, as I said, I do agree with a lot of what has been said, and I don't think there's an alternative to capital. And I don't think in capital, I completely agree. There's nothing inherently good or bad about capitalism. And in fact, capitalism has, economic growth has lifted millions of people out of poverty. So I'm not starting from the premise that it's all wrong and we need to start with throw capitalism out and experiment with go down some of the paths of history. But I do think that we can't sit here and say, well, it's just sort of tinkering around the edges. Really, I just wanted to paint the picture away from Davos, what it's really like for the women and children that we work with. And then the other area is the crisis in business. I mean, I also sit on the board of a British, company, British Telecom, and we try to run our business very ethically because we're very aware of this, and it was launched at the beginning of this week, the Edelman survey on trust in business. We're very aware of this very fragile trust in business. And so I think, that's another area. It's, the people at the bottom are concerned, businesses are concerned, leaders coming to Davos are concerned. So we can get on to the solutions and the whys and wherefores, but I just wanted to paint that picture.
Thank you. And we will get on to the solutions and what we might do about it in just a second. But first, let me call on Mohammed Yunus. You've listened to all of this. You have, and particularly respond to the take on finance, because you've revolutionized finance in some a very fundamental way. So tell me, how do you view the ethical nature of finance in particular?
Before I go to the ethical part of finance, I'll just mention in general about the ethical part of it, because that's the discussion going on. I think essential of capitalism is ethics-free. It's not based on ethics. We can put ethics into it. If I'm a Muslim, I put my Muslim ethics into my business. If you are a Christian, you put your Christian ethics if you want to. But you can do business without putting anything in it. If I'm ethical business, for example, I would like to say I shall not do any harm to any people. That's my ethics. That's where I imposed it. Business didn't want it. I shall not do any harm to planet. That I put ethics, but it's ethics-free. I shall not get involved in corruption. That's ethics. I shall not do any deception. That's ethics. So if you want to talk about this, this is not the one that you can impose ethics. You can say that you have to have some ethics. You can have a kind of general consensus over it, or you can do it as an individual. But fundamental thing doesn't have it. And the second point I want to make, the capitalist system is basically based on selfishness. I'm not saying it's a bad word, it's a selfishness. Some people have been saying this is the engine of capitalism, that the selfishness, that I am driven by that selfishness. I think a capitalist system done a very major harm in designing that system based on selfishness, because human beings are not all selfishness. So they misinterpreted human being in designing a system which is based on selfishness. It's for my pleasure, it's for my accumulation that I am in that business. So that one, capitalism need to reinterpret or truly interpret human being, which is a multidimensional being, not a kind of a cutout a segment of a human being and be put there. We are not kind of a money-chasing robots, which literally business world has made us into. We can make a lot of other interpretations of it. Basically, we're money-chasing robots. That's why 85 people can accumulate all this, because they have chased it very well. I'm not condemning them, but they've done it. The help of the system that we built is the system fault. It's not the fault of the person. System made it into so. For example, institutions which are built is built on this principle, that the more you have, you can get more. That's where the financial system and all that ethics question you raise. Is it ethical in a country like United States, for example, to have only source of loan for a poor person, low-income person, is to go to a payday lenders? It's a thriving business, multi-billion-dollar business. It thrives in any city, any little town. It's a thriving business. I'm sure it's a thriving in Europe too. I see a lot of it, UK, loan sharking, money lending, payday lenders. Interest rate, 500%, 1,000%, 2,000%. The capitalist system doesn't solve it. We raised that question back in Bangladesh, way back, said why loan sharks do to people harm doing lending, make lots of money. Why don't I lend the money myself? So this is what I did. And people loved it. And out of which gave the microcredit and so on. People said, no, bank cannot do it. This is not the bank. I said, why not? Are they not paying back the money? Are you not getting the interest? Aren't you not covering your cost? Then what is your problem? Today, nearly 40 years later, it's still the same. We call it microfinance. It's a separate thing. Banks are not the one doing it. It's NGO should be doing it. Why is that? You saw the ethical system of financing? Finance disagreeing with the 2/3 of the world population has no access to that? And you're still in a footnote? It's not a mainstream? Why is that? So this is one. Why people are poor? You said we sing glory of capitalism, how many people came out. Good. But we should also look at how many people are not out, trapped into it. This is something you have to see simultaneously. Say one part and you don't say other part, it's not a solution. The capitalist system naturally doesn't do it. The proof, you have a welfare system. Why? If capitalism has solved it, it would solve everybody. The failure of capitalism is the existence of welfare system, that you have to go out and dish out money to individual, capable individual. Why people are unemployed? This is a systemic problem of the capitalist system itself. Not a single person should be unemployed. There's nothing wrong with the person. Every young person that you mentioned are unemployed is a very capable person. And you say the future is doomed. Who doomed it? Who condemned that young person? It's the system condemned it, not himself. System has no right to condemn human being. It's the human being should be condemning the system which doesn't solve the problem. So we have to redesign the system so that it can work for everybody.
That's an excellent segue into figuring out how we're perhaps not going to redesign the whole system, but how we're going to improve bits of it. Just one second, I'm going to turn to you in a minute. Let me just summarize this first one briefly, because I want to move on to solutions and who has the responsibility with them, because I think there is broad agreement amongst all of you. Perhaps, Mohammed, you are slightly slightly not quite with the broader consensus about how much the system itself needs to be changed.
But just let me come back to one thing.
Okay.
Whilst we'd all agree with a lot of what has just been said, is it selfish to start a company and build a company over, let's say, 30 years, like we've done, and employ 170,000 people in 110 countries? Is that selfish? Surely, I mean, the sort of things that you're talking about, these greedy people that sit behind a desk speculating, is maybe you're right in what you say. But in terms of building an industrial enterprise or a service enterprise, that gives so much benefit. And then if you take the long-term view, you redeploy the profits to balance it. And the last point is on interest rates, right? What's happened, and this is where I do violently agree, what's happened since 2008 is that government policy has been dominated by low interest rates. Companies were badly affected by that weekend, that Lehman weekend in September 2008, and they become overly conservative, far too short term. They are hoarding cash. The banks are not lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, as they should do, and the inequality has increased because cheap money has benefited the wealthy rather than the poor. So on the interest rate thing, I would agree, and particularly in the last 5 or 6 years. But on the engine of success, and whether we're all selfish, greedy people, if we build businesses which benefit society through employment and other benefits, I don't think that's...
Well, you very successfully provoked, but we have to let the other businessmen... No, just 1 second. Let Stanley jump in, and Peter, if you want to too, and then we can go back to that. We may get to solutions later on.
I'm having a hard time controlling myself.
I know. It's yours. The floor is yours.
So here's the story. The 85 wealthiest people in the world is not the issue. I mean, you could debate some aspects of it. The issue is that there's inequality and there's a lack of access to basics for millions, probably 1 billion people. You would know that. So capitalism without training wheels does not work. Capitalism needs training wheels. So we speak about unemployment. Actually, the problem with unemployment, and I think there's going to be a challenge in the developed world, and particularly in the US, I don't think we're going to get below 5% again. Why? Because we don't have the right educated workforce. So we have a huge imbalance in the United States. We can't find programmers. The immigration authorities are limiting the number of programmers allowed into the United States. So regulation is in the way. What we need to do is turn out programmers, and we need to turn them out in the United States, and then we won't need the regulation for the immigrants. So the bottom line is we can't have capitalism needs its training wheels. Companies should not only be assessed by earnings per share. Companies should be assessed by some form of sustainability index. This concept is well defined, but instead what we find the SEC and agencies like that doing is just putting more and more regulation, more forms to be filled out, instead of looking at the right things. You can't regulate crooks. If they're going to exist, they're going to exist. You can't stop them. But you can make sure that the right metrics are looked at. You can make sure that board of director members are not only judged as to whether they ran huge, successful financial institutions, but whether they're able to develop a good culture in a company. So I think, in one way or another, the whole notion of the free market, the capitalist environment, needs training wheels and not more regulation, and not a way in which, at the end of the day, the system of capitalism is attacked, but rather we need to give it some training wheels to get a more balanced methodology in place to reach the needs of society.
Yes, please do.
No, I have the feeling that we are discussing two separate issues, really. I think that obviously we are very much concerned about mass poverty in the world and the difficulty of living with $1 a day and so on and so on. And it is, we may say that there's been improvement, and certainly there's been improvement in the last 20 years, but we are far away. But is this because of capitalism, or is this because of other things?
Or do we think that capitalism will help us close the gap?
I don't know, but perhaps yes. I would say that this has very much to do with other isms. Imperialism, colonialism, and things that in the past have led us here. Now, having become more prosperous, we are worrying about these things more than we were in the past. So capitalism has helped us really to realize that these are very serious issues. This is one thing. The other thing is that why are we discussing these things today and not 3-4 years ago? 3-4 years ago, there were those poor, even more. The situation was even more complicated. The problem is that we see instead some failures, massive failures, to generate prosperity, equality, jobs now in the system that we are used to call the capitalistic system. And why is it so? This is the issue. I think in part is because of the failures of finance and so on, but mostly because the world changes continuously, and we suppose that the world is linear, is stationary, and so on. It's not. It has changed dramatically, and the skills that are needed now are totally different than the ones we have been able to produce. So we need a transition. In this transition, the major risk is that we are not going to give equality of opportunities to all, and the only way really is to invest in education, in a different attitude, also to invest in human capital ourselves, not only the government, not only the state, and it is a challenge.
But I don't think that we're saying that it's capitalism's fault. I think what we're saying is how can we, if we're moving on to what the solution is, how can we work with the capitalist system that we've got, because it is the system that we've got, and we can argue about whether, but, and I think it has had many benefits, and how can we help make it work? What needs to happen to make that system work, to have even more benefits and to address some of these concerns that we all to a greater or lesser extent feel exist? I quite like, 2 points to pick up on from my fellow panelists. Martins, your point I thought really struck a chord with me, saying that it depends what you're trying to achieve. And actually we sort of got suckered into thinking that economics is the end in itself, whereas economics is a means. We've got to decide what it is that we want to achieve, in a country, in Europe, or in whatever entity, or in a business, as an individual. And then economics is the system that you tweak, and governments can put in place incentives through tax and subsidy to help get to what it is that we're trying to achieve. So I think remembering that, and I quite like your point about, I'm not sure about the word training wheels, because that sounds like at some point you take them off, but I do think that this idea that markets are completely free is a fallacy, because there are existing tax and subsidies, and there are regulations. So it's about getting that environment right, in some case stripping away. It's about getting purer market information. And I think there are some opportunities there ahead with technology and ways that we can get better market information so that better decisions can be made.
Let's just focus, because it's a subject that all of you have brought up in different ways, which is this notion of the inequality of today's outcomes. Now, you've all mentioned that the capitalist system has brought huge growth. It does mean far fewer people in abject poverty than there were before. But we see right now a very skewed distribution of the gains. And certainly in the advanced world, we see the average worker's living standards stagnant or falling, while the gains of growth, such that we've had them, have gone to the very top. That, and I'm struck actually by pretty much everybody in Davos kind of agrees about that. And as you say, inequality is now at the top of the agenda. But then the typical conversation goes, well, technological change means that there's a return to skill. It's better if you're educated and skilled. Full stop. What do we do next? There's talk of education. That's an interesting one. Let's focus on that perhaps a bit. But what are the solutions? What should government, business be trying to do? Because we've kind of been here before. 100 years ago, we had income distributions quite similar to the ones we had now. We had very big changes in government policy. We had huge investment in education. We had redistributive taxation. We had a lot of stupid things too. What are the solutions people should be focusing on now?
Can I get the floor now?
Yeah.
Okay. First, to respond to that interest rate quickly. We run a microcredit program in New York City. There are 6 branches of Grameen America. We have over 20,000 borrowers in last 5 years if we started. 100% women. Average loan is about $1,500. Interest rate is 15% in a declining basis. And we we cover our cost, we reach our payback period, and so on. So this can be done. And we have done it in Bangladesh. I didn't give the example of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a different story. So I'm giving example of New York City, and that's where we want. Repayment rate is 99.4%. No collateral, no document, no lawyers poring over anything. But it works. It works. Now it is expanded in several cities in the United States. So I'm giving example. This can be done. But why doesn't the capitalist system adopt it? Why does it leave it to the NGO activity? Why don't the financial institutions say, hey, this is a great idea. In the unemployment situation, this could be a good idea to do that. So this is where the capitalist system goes wrong. You see, unemployment is not created by the person. That's what I underlined repeatedly. It's created by the system. So we have to go back to the system to fix it. I said we use the selfishness to create businesses. That's what the present interpretation of capitalist system is. What happened to our selflessness? We can build businesses on the basis of selflessness. Businesses. We can solve problems in a business way. Problem of poverty in a business way. Problem of unemployment in a business way. Problem of healthcare in a healthcare is a mess everywhere in the world. People are sick. Healthcare is becoming more and more expensive. Go to the United States if you want to find out what happens to the healthcare system. That's not a capitalist glory thing that you'll be talking about. Completely rotten. the way system works. Whole healthcare system can be brought down much cheaper, much easier to reach out to every single person. But capitalist system doesn't go there. Their profit will be challenged. They don't want to lose their profits. That's where capitalist system is wrong. So we are creating a different kind of business. That's what we did the Grameen Bank. That's why we do all of the things. Now we are reforesting whole of Haiti as a social business. Business to solve the problem of deforestation of Haiti by making it reforested, because it can be done in a business way, not in a charity way. So this is what we need, a new interpretation of human being as a person who is selfish, at the same time equally as a strongly selfless person. That door is blocked in the present interpretation of human capitalism. Once you open it and you said we agree on we don't agree with the capitalist system is working. We need a reinterpretation of capitalism if we want to improve it, redesign of the capitalism. All these problems can be solved. And it's a question of just moving away from the only single-track money-making proposition that we have today.
I think the success of what you've inspired and the whole movement you've inspired is testament to the importance of what you're doing. But I would suggest that perhaps it's not the only thing that we need to do.
I didn't say it's the only thing. I said there is a thing.
Maybe, Stanley, you can...
Many other people can bring other things too.
That's what we're going to do right now.
Grameen Bank, to me, is the model company. You have used the free market, you've used capitalism to do good. There's a whole movement starting up of what's called higher ambitions companies. These are companies with a sense of purpose that is beyond returning profits to shareholders. I, for one, have a company, yes, we're in healthcare, where I've said formally to our shareholders, Henry Schein does not exist for the shareholders. We agree to provide a good rate of return, and it's been a very good one. We've actually grown our shareholder value, our market cap, by 23% each year for the last 17 years. But we exist for more than simply the shareholders. We exist for our customers, who happens to be healthcare providers, and we want them to run a better medical, dental, or veterinary practice. We deal with our suppliers. We want them to do very well with us. Our team and the communities they're in, we want them to do well. Our investors, we want them to get a good rate of return. But actually, the secret sauce at Henry Schein is our social responsibility, where, like you, we have been able to align our interests with societies. And I would say that companies that do very well. And there's a good amount of information now, Harvard Business Studies, Babson studies, that show that companies that align their interests with society generally do a better business and better returns than those that don't. So instead of ending capitalism or controlling it too much, I think we should look at what works. And Grameen Bank is the perfect example.
Don't you think, Stan, that most businesses, as opposed to 5 or 10 years ago, have espoused stakeholder theory, value-led companies?
Yes.
We know, on a purely practical basis, that our people like the idea. They find it motivating. It's a good way of retaining the great talent that you want to retain, and the war for talent is going to get even greater as population trends, demographics move against us. But isn't it fair to say that the position has changed very significantly from where it was 5 or 10 years ago? And the sort of stakeholder theory, they don't espouse it to the degree perhaps that you do at Schein, but directionally, the work that we do, Peter's company, or for others, you look at what Unilever does, what IBM does, what IKEA does, all things that we've been directly involved in. And what you know is that every chairman and CEO, it's not greenwashing anymore, espouses as a core part of their strategy the social objectives. And by the way, to maximize your return, I would argue, if you're long-term, and you take into account the stakeholders, the economics is the result of good behavior, whether it's less enlightened capitalism or less selfish capitalism.
Absolutely agree with you. I think the degree to which this has moved, specifically since 2009, is enormous. But doing the right thing is not about issuing a check to a charity. Of course, that's important, and that's important to sustain NGOs. But it's important to work with the NGOs. So if you're going to give money to CARE, get involved in the board. Get involved. Your whole company will be different if you can engage your team, and I think that's how you advance society.
I mean, I would agree with that, but I would say, and I agree, Martin, that most, you can't, it's hard to find a company, particularly here at Davos, who isn't espousing these kinds of values and, struggling with how to kind of engage their company in the way that you've just described. And Mohammed also, looking to see how to expand into markets that are underserved, because that can actually be good for business as well as achieving a social good. But I think that what I see, sitting as Save the Children, we have relationships with a number of companies, and it's still quite unusual to find companies that are really willing to do two things, which I think are important. One is, and this is hard, do a root and branch look at all the social and environmental impacts that your company is having in the world. Really, look at your power consumption, your carbon footprint. Looking at your value chain. The suppliers that supply you, your distribution chain. How people who don't work for you directly are nonetheless treated. Looking at your products that you produce. If you're producing food, how is that actually being used? We have a conversation about breast milk substitutes, and about how it's so important to, and I know Nestlé is looking to do this, make sure that you conform to WHO rules. So really looking at all the aspects of your business is difficult, but that is not widely done yet. And you mentioned earlier about standard, integrated sustainability index or integrated reporting, and there isn't a standard one yet. There's lots of different, and I think the sooner that we can get to that, the better, because I think at the moment people feel it's all a bit smoke and mirrors, and the sooner that companies feel confident producing those in a standardized way and also admitting where the challenges are, because you will sign up to do things like reduce your carbon footprint, and then you'll struggle to do them. You'll sign up as Nestlé to meet the WHO code of conduct on breast milk substitute, and you've got a huge organisation, and you'll struggle in some countries. But being honest about that and addressing it, none of us are perfect. I think stakeholders will support that. So I think that is the bit that is quite unusual. That's one. The other one is actually using your core business to make a change. I mean, it's quite obvious. With a healthcare business, you could think about how that applies to that applies to the Millennium Development Goal to stop, women and children dying in childbirth, etc. I can imagine, Martin, how you would, want to use your core competence in communications and in growing markets, actually, and reaching the bottom of the pyramid.
Which we do.
But I think finding those examples is still not as common as. But I think we're making great progress.
Peter, can I get you to react to that in two ways? Firstly, do you agree with that there is more that you could do, that you as corporations could do? And secondly, to sort of link that back to the earlier part of the discussion, is that enough? I mean, we're talking about ethical capitalism. Is it enough if you are all behaving as ethically as possible, and you've got further to go, as we've been told? Is that enough, or do we as a society need to think beyond that to more that needs to be done, for instance, by government?
Well, I would start where Yunus left us. He said capitalism is ethic-free. That means, in other words, that any company that wants to exercise this activity has to put itself a value system to the capitalism. You cannot have a pure capitalism. It doesn't exist. It always needs to have a value that surrounds it. Now, this value will depend on where the company is, what the history of the company is, and things like this. But this is the most fundamental issue. Therefore, if we are looking into a company, for example, for acquisition, before I look into the balance sheet, I look what is their business principle, what is their value proposition. And if this value proposition cannot fit with the value proposition of Nestlé, we will not make an acquisition because it doesn't fit. So that's the first thing. Capitalism, somebody said, it is just a tool. It's one of the tools. I don't think capitalism has a fault that we have the inequality. I give a very brutal example from today. I mean, I went out there to the Syrian refugee run, and I can only invite anybody in this room, go and experience the refugee run from Syria. We have 3 million of Syrians today outside of Syria. We have 6 million of refugees in Syria. 9 million of people. They are now part of the extreme poorest people in the worst condition you can have. Is this a fault of capitalism? Nothing to do. You cannot blame that we still have 900 million people in extreme poverty because of capitalism. Okay? So I just wanted, because this is constantly going through the press. I mean, it's because we have capitalism, therefore we have 900 million. This is not true. Okay? There are other reasons for that. Why part of this is still in extreme poverty. And we have to work together to help to get them out of there. Huh? But you cannot say it is because we have capitalism, therefore we have 900 million
I
extreme
don't
poverty.
think anyone on this panel has been saying that, actually. Just
Well, if you are discussing that we have these problems which have been brought up, and they're absolutely correct. I'm fully agree. We have 3.5 billion of people who are not well off. We have about 800 million who are in extreme poverty, which is non-acceptable, I agree. But you cannot make your life so easy to say they are there because we have capitalism.
Okay, let me phrase this slightly differently, perhaps to provoke you. Do you think it is the result of the capitalist system that we have basically income levels in the advanced world for people of mid-skill and below stagnant or falling, and the overwhelming gains of growth now going to people at the very top? Is that the result of the capitalist system, or is it something completely different?
Well, first of all, it is the result that we have value creation, and we have value creation, is a result of the capitalist system. And, you know, capitalism, first of all, is not perfect, no way about it, but it's like democracy. Democracy is not perfect, but up to now, we have not found a better social system than democracy, and we have not found up to now a better system, okay, of creating wealth than capitalism. And I mean, you ask anybody who has lived in communist countries or something like this, they will, I think, tell you very fast that's still the best system.
But
is
maybe
it
another way
perfect?
to frame
It's not perfect.
But another way to frame, I mean, I like Stanley's question about, you know, so why is it that we've got the growth that we've got, and it's not great at the moment, but it is returning to the higher end faster than it is to the bottom end?
It is not. It is, sorry. If you really look at the repartition of the money, the big part went to the Chinese middle class of 550 million, okay, and not to one of those Bill Gates or something like this. And you know, you say, okay, the Bill Gates and the Bloombergs, and they are the one who have the things. Well, finally, if you have a Bill Gates who then take all his richness and gives it back into a foundation so that it goes back and helps you in order to achieve yours.
But wages
There's
have
not
been
so
kept
wrong about
flat
it.
in
This
the, I
is
mean,
so
if you
wrong
take
about
the
it.
UK,
Can we turn to the economist around here? Ignacio, give us your perspective on this.
I think that we have to define the objectives and then try to find the solutions. And there is, I think, not a single solution for all our problems. As a matter of fact, I think microcredit has a lot to give, but it cannot deliver high growth, innovation, and so on. It can redistribute and give opportunities, as I think schooling at a very early age, free for all, can give opportunities. On my side, as a regulator, I think that the market is not a laissez-faire framework. It is an institution. As an institution, it has been to be well designed and regulated. There are rules of the game which have to be respected. If we are incapable of having them respected, there is a problem. If there is tax evasion, there is a problem. And there might be a reason for tax evasion, but this does not mean that this is an attitude that we should encourage. Same for corruption. So there are a number of issues that we have to work on, but I think to better regulate, not to regulate more, to have the market working better, and to try to use as well as possible the instruments we have. Today, I was reading very quickly newspaper titles and agencies. There was an interesting title that says that the Pope, this new Pope, which is a pretty interesting person, said that internet is a gift of God. Well, but what does he want to say? I mean, this is apart from Bill Gates and this kind of thing. It is something that has to be used in the best way that we can, because it is very useful. At the same time, internet is responsible for putting out of work millions of people, because if you go and buy your air ticket, you don't go anymore and talk to a person and this makes a phone call and then somebody prints the ticket and so on. Now you just go on internet, the web, push a button, write a few things, and you have your ticket. So those people will not work anymore. The 3D printers now help you produce things that before had hundreds, thousands of people. So what's going on? Obviously, there will be major reduction in costs, large opportunities, high incomes, very unequally distributed. The big challenge is how to redistribute. So redistribution, I think, is the big challenge. And at the same time, education. Education means to find the jobs that the future will give us. 10 years ago, nobody of you would think that would come here with this little iPad that you are playing with.
I'm playing with it whilst you're speaking.
Okay? But, you know, this is creating a lot of new jobs, opportunities, and so on and so on. So we have to make the rules of the game beneficial for all to find a future. It is a big challenge, not easy.
Okay, Martin, now that you've been outed,
well,
you can...
you know, I find it interesting that you refer to, you use the word tax evasion. In Italy, it was governmentally encouraged. Fact.
No, but there was a guy who was saying that it was
okay. I'm not making it personal, but that's a fact. So it came it was instigated or encouraged. I should stimulated, praised. No, he went to the financial the tax authorities in his first term and said it's the right or it's.
I totally agree with you. It is
but anyway,
morally wrong. Okay.
Yeah, but it's not capitalism in this case. It's government or the approach. Coming back to the question you raised, Annie, about what's the problem? The failure in the system, I think, is in the last 5 years. So since 2008, in order to prevent a collapse in the system, and Lehman had a bigger effect on corporates, in my view, and in our view, I think at WPP, than it did have on consumers. Because the corporate world nearly came to an end. GE is supposed to be within 24, 48 hours of being unable to refinance its commitments. Warren Buffett said it was America's financial Pearl Harbor. So it was a real big shock to the system. Since then, coming back to the point about long term, since then, companies have been focused relentlessly, and we know we're part of the supply chain. And I can tell you, when I'm asked what is my biggest concern, is that companies are hoarding cash, 4.2 trillion on net cash on balance sheets, buying back stock, because that's where they improve their performance, rather than investing in capital expenditure, or indeed in brands, which I'm really interested in building the investment in brands. That's the real problem. And come back to the solutions. One of it, and Stan touched on it in his opening comments, one of the solutions is KPIs. There are very few, there are companies that espouse corporate sustainability and make big efforts, but they don't build it into their reward system. The CEOs and the people under the CEOs do not have, as Mark Bolland of Marks and Spencer's, we had a session today, and part of his KPI, his incentives system, is based on that, and that fans down inside the organization. Same thing applies to investment institutions. What you said about not just focus on EPS. I mean,
Well,
there are
KPI is
a key performance indicator.
an EPS, earnings per share. Just so
Earnings per share, yes.
we're
Just
getting into
be sure.
gobbledygook
I'm sure
here.
the audience knows exactly. What it is.
Well,
But the point is that we have to alter the horizon to a much longer term. And since 2008, I mean, the average life of a CEO in companies is around, depending on whose statistics you believe, 3 to 5 years. The average life of a chief marketing officer in America is 2 years. So people are frightened inside corporations of making mistakes. We're not, I mean, capitalism is about taking risks. And coming back to the question of interest rates and banks not lending, it's part of the same thing. So it's a lot, I would agree that the failure has been in the last 5 years because governments, to stop a total financial panic and breakdown, what have they been doing for 5 years? Giving money away for nothing.
Well, I just wanted to open it now to questions because I think we've had a pretty rich discussion on the problem. We've had a slightly less rich discussion on solutions, but we may get there. But I do want to give you all a chance to ask some questions. Please don't make long statements because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. And we'll then have more of a discussion after that. I'm going to put my glasses on, otherwise I won't see you. Yes, lady here in the 5th row.
Hello, I'm Lakshmi Mohan from India. And thank you very much for the session. And my question is to Mr. Yunus. I loved what you said about that human beings, real human beings, are multidimensional and not just money-minded and one-dimensional. And improving the state of the world or every change in society has to start from within, and correct me if I'm wrong. So is there anything we can do as individuals to have a society with human beings, real human beings who are multi-dimensional? Thank you.
One issue that I was trying to bring attention to, that selfishness versus the selflessness, is a part of the same human being. They are not two different human beings. It's in us. But the present interpretation of capitalism has blocked away the selfish part, selfless part, focused only on selfish part. That's what went wrong. Many of the problems are created by that. If we build businesses on the selfless side, every business can create a business on the selfless motive. That will be addressing the problem, unemployment problem, right on your door. If a big company, small company can create a social business, meaning that I'm not interested in making profit, it's delinking from the personal motive, linking only on the solution motive. I do this business to take these 10 unemployed young people out of the unemployment. That's my business. And I successfully done it. If business runs well, 5 people, they're happy, they're doing it. I own the business, I get my money back. This is social business. We can do that. You can do that. And we have enough technology in the world, enough creativity in the world. But all of it is going into money-making purposes. That's what I'm complaining. I'm not complaining demolish capitalism, reinterpret capitalism, include selflessness. And you do it. Every company, every person will do both so that we can address every single problem we have. You name it, you can find a solution for it. That's in a business way, in a sustainable. We used to do it in a charity way. That's why I'm criticizing the welfare system. You kill those people by putting them on welfare. They are human beings, they are creative beings. Putting them on money is not a solution. You can solve the problem of unemployment. I bet you cannot solve the problem of welfare in Europe ever and ever with the present interpretation of capitalism. So I'm not demolishing it. I'm saying if somebody wants to keep it the way it is, don't touch it, we are great, you're wrong. You continuously improve it. That's what I'm saying, improve it, review it. If they don't have any ethics, bring ethics to it. I do no harm to people, planet, in any way. And I don't practice any deception and involve it. And they become good businesses. And at the same time, get involved with social businesses, address one of your problems, take a small slice. You have enough creative power to solve that problem. If all this creative power went into that, there will be no problem in the world.
Mohammed, I think one of the points of discussion we seem to have had from all 3 corporate representatives here is that there is a much broader concept of what the corporation is doing, that all of you have talked about, whether it's corporate.
That's what I'm saying. If you're satisfied, you don't proceed.
I don't think any of us are satisfied here, but there is
always
movement.
See there's something I still can do.
Yeah,
that's what I want.
The lady that asked the question I would describe as a millennial, so a young person. the millennials as a generation, the latest generation, really are changing the way, they absorb a lot, I think, of the philosophy we've heard. And the fact that they are espousing good causes, trying to not be as selfish as has been pointed out, is a big factor, because companies, in order to prosper, will have to embrace a very different philosophy. I mean, I see it with the people in our organization. Every year we produce a sustainability report where we list what our clients do in CSR and what we do, pro bono, and our people take great pride in that, and it is a big motivator. And the reason is, I think the new generation, the latest generation, has a very different attitude and a much more selfless attitude than perhaps previous generations have had.
You wanted to offer
Well,
an
just to give a
example?
couple of examples of that, I completely agree with that. And we organisations like Save the Children have been the beneficiaries of that societal change, because as young people like yourself have sort of come into the workforce, they've looked to work for companies that are not just making money but actually helping to change the world. And a lot of those companies look to then partner with organisations like Save the Children or the World Food Programme or other, in order to attract and retain those top people coming out of university. So we get millions of pounds worth of free consulting from BCG, from a top legal firm also here at Davos Freshfields, from the headhunting company, Swiss originally, Egon Zehnder, because that's what they're looking to do.
Yes, briefly.
So that point, and Martin's point, 100% right. The younger generation wants to get engaged with companies that want to make a difference. And I would submit 5, 6, 7 years from now, it'll be impossible to hire the cream of the crop. In fact, I think really the only way to solve this issue that we're talking about, these societal issues, is through public-private partnerships. And the biggest issue, I think, is we have to teach people how to fish and not give them the fish. Of course, if they don't have fish to eat, of course we need to do that. And if I were a young person, I would get engaged in public-private partnerships. What I would do, I would find an NGO that works for the company. I would go meet with company people that are engaged in social responsibility. I'd pull the politicians in. I would find a way to make a difference through public-private partnerships that in the end can teach those that don't have the resources they need to live to catch fish. And at the end of the day, I will say to business leaders around the world, if you are not changing your culture in your company to be engaged in societal issues, you will not attract the best talent. And at the end of the day, business needs talent. And without the best talent, you will not succeed and create shareholder value.
Thank you.
May I intervene?
Very briefly, because I'd like to get a couple more questions in.
Just because I want to say this is a millennial girl. That's nice. When my generation is a generation who went to school, to university in the late 60s, in the mid 60s, and I have to say that I chose economics because I thought it was a good way to do something good, to change the world. And a lot of people of my generation did that. Then 70s, 80s, 90s, the mood changed. We are at the swing of the pendulum. I think we should capitalize on these young people. I mean, this is really what the richness, the wealth that we have.
The other big change is the rise of women in the workforce, right? Which we all, I mean, they are over 50% of the world's population, I think it's true to say. And intelligence is distributed equally between men and women, but that intelligence, so that's another, apart from the young, it's the opportunities that we all hope women will have, and certainly in our business, I risk it by saying women are better than men. I risk saying that, and it's true, often because their EQs and their organizational skills in terms of time management are far superior to men, I think, we find. So I think that's another factor, big factor that's going to happen.
Let's try and get a couple more questions in. Gentleman here in the third row.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Juli. I'm actually an economist. And I really liked the idea that you said KPIs, key performance indicators, are important. Now the question is this. The government of Bhutan is not only measuring GDP, but they have a new index, the Gross National Happiness Index. What do you think of this happiness index? And how could this change the discussion of ethical capitalism? Thank you.
You're suggesting a happiness index by company?
No, nationally.
I think actually it's part of the same phenomenon, actually. I mean, exactly the same, is that in order to get balance and not to be just totally pursuing financial criteria in the short term, you broaden the index, you broaden the evaluation system, and you make sure that it permeates the whole structure of the organization. So in a way, I think what you're suggesting is the same but on a national level. I mean, how you measure that happiness index as an economist. I'm a failed economist, you're a successful one. How you measure that is very difficult.
Ignacio, is Italy moving towards a gross happiness index?
No, I'm also an economist, and I was the chief economist of the OECD before the OECD started to work on this happiness thing. Now, so why didn't think? Well, I think, and I know very well Joe Stiglitz and the others who have put a lot of efforts on that, this is a serious thing. For a large part of the population, happiness and income go together. And actually, up to certain levels, it is very difficult to be happy without having enough resources to enjoy it. So this is a very tricky thing, but at the very bottom, for the very poor and for the, richer society as ours is, at a certain point there are some trade-offs, and we should consider with care. Trade-offs like environment, trade-offs like altruism, the ability to be happy because others are happy. The culture, there are really a large number of things that really are, may at times be discriminated because of an excessive value given on income. But I think this is not a major macro issue. This is not to create the massive employment that we need. Overall, the rate of change of GDP and the rate of change of GDH more or less go together.
Did you want
to
add
something?
something?
Just
Yes.
make a point on this?
Yes.
Economists probably didn't pay attention to that other part. That's why they didn't develop those measurements. In order to make their life simple, we cannot give up our life. We have to design those things so that we can measure what is happiness, how we measure it. If we pay our attention, we'll definitely find a way to do that. And this is one issue which comes back again and again between selfish business and a selfless business, because selfish business can be measured in terms of money, how much money I made. That's how much profit I made. The more money I make, the more happy I get. That's a measurement, one-to-one relationship. I said, making money is a happiness? It's true. But making other people happy is a super happiness. But nobody measures it. This is the problem.
Thank you. Stanley.
Mohammed, Mr. Yunus, I want to pick up on that point because actually, I think you're right. We don't have a happiness index in my company, but what we do is every 2 years, we do a culture survey. Everyone in the company takes a survey, and one of the items in that survey is, are you happy with the company's social responsibility? And it gets amongst the highest ratings on that culture survey. The bottom line is, I think, if companies are socially responsible, the team really values that company, wants to get involved with that company. Grameen Bank was successful because your employees were proud of what they were doing. And I think that's a key driver in advancing shareholder value and at the same time economic wealth in society.
Thank you. One or two more questions. There was a gentleman here, and then I'm going to go to one at the back.
Tim Lehmann, thanks. I'm running a journalism incubator for millennials, by the way. I'm based in New York City and in Zurich. I have a question to Mr. Brabeck, a very short one. Actually, Nestlé sponsors the refugee camp run here that's taking place, and it tries to simulate the camp life of a Syrian refugee. The Economist ran a story in 2011 on this and called it poverty porn. We have an unconfirmed source that says that Nestlé does business in Syria with the regime of Syria.
Is this question about the topic of this discussion?
Yeah, it's holding a firm accountable, and that's Nestlé. He's representing Nestlé. So my question is, does Nestlé do business in Syria with the Assad regime? And if yes, isn't it hypocritical to sponsor the awareness of refugee camps and doing business with the regimes that cause these refugee lives?
Well, I thank you for the question. I think it's a very interesting one. It is absolutely true that about, it's now 15 years when I became CEO, I insisted that we were building a factory in Syria after having acquired the biggest food business in Israel. And at that time, we established Nestlé Syria, and we established Nestlé Bethlehem in Palestine, because I considered it more than fair that both the Palestinians have a Nestlé presence and the Syrians have a Nestlé presence. Okay, this is about 15 years ago. Now, interesting, talking about the refugee issue, we have been employing 878 people in Syria until February last year. February last year, in the night, our factory has been bombarded and has been destroyed. 470 people lost their job. We kept them 6 months on the payroll. We have still 470 people there. We still keep them on the payroll, although they cannot physically come to work. Okay? You know, I talked this afternoon in the refugee camp about this aspect. There's nothing worse than to be a refugee outside of your own country. And I think as much as it is important as we are doing, we're working in the refugee camps with the Red Cross, for example, in order to help those people out. More importantly, I consider, is to assure that we don't have refugees, and we support those people in their own countries so that they don't become refugees. And by keeping up our business in Syria, even today, I think we are doing extremely helpful for those people. They don't have to become political refugees.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. Yeah, gentleman at the back there, in the middle, in the orange sweater.
Not a red one.
My name is Stefan Kleinsorger from Strasbourg. Peter, I admire your response to that question, but I'm still much more in favor with the philosophy of Yunus. I have a question to you, Peter, and to Stan and to Martin. Do you like your companies to pay taxes? Why do I ask this question? We are talking about paying taxes in developed countries, not in banana republics, and the taxes are used to create infrastructure and to help saving banks. But if you do not trust the efficiency of a state to use the taxes efficiently, should a government levy extra corporate taxes for special purposes? This afternoon, we talked about migration and the problems. So should, for example, the UK and Switzerland and the US levy extra taxes to solve the problems of migrants in their countries?
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. Stanley, why don't you start with it?
I'm not in favor of paying taxes, but whatever the tax rules are, we comply with, and generally my company, if you look at the financials, is on the higher side of what corporations pay in the form of taxation. Having said that all, I would say the job also of government is to efficiently use that money, number one, and number two, take care of society's real issues. Governments need to do what individuals can't do individually, and that is important for a good society to operate. So yes, taxes have to be paid. They have to be paid correctly, and government has a responsibility to use that money and use it well.
Martin.
Yeah. About a year ago, I got myself into hot water when on BBC, actually it was January the 1st or January the 2nd of last year, 2008, I said in the course of an interview that corporation tax was the level of corporation tax was a matter of judgment, and that caused a little bit of a furore. But I think it was calling it as it is. To your question, if you are aggressive in looking at the tax rules, and I'm not talking about evasion, I'm talking about avoidance, the first being illegal, avoidance being legal, you can minimize your corporation tax. Now, you've seen Google, Facebook, Starbucks, Amazon, for example, come under tremendous pressure in the UK because they have substantial operations in the UK, substantial revenues, and yet they pay zero tax. So what I think is really interesting about the question is, I think the answer is you have to exhibit judgment in terms of how far you're prepared to go in minimizing tax legally to the rules. The Google response to the criticism in the UK is we've done nothing wrong, we've just obeyed the rules. There's another problem here is that different countries have competitive regimes in terms of encouraging companies to locate, build their plants, and develop their businesses. So there's an international, global, competitive element here. You know, Singapore, for example, is extremely effective in encouraging businesses to locate their operations, particularly in Asia and Singapore, because of low tax rates, both personal and corporate. Now, the other final point I want to make is this. We do pay very significant taxes. You know, 60% of our $18 billion of revenue goes to our people. That's the staff cost to revenue ratio, as we would call it, about $12 billion. On that, we pay employment taxes, social security taxes, etc., apart from the corporate value-added tax, apart from the corporation tax that we pay in various jurisdictions. The burden is not excessive. We do try and take advantage of the rules to some extent, but the fundamental point is very linked to what we've been talking about. Taxation policy inside companies is a matter of judgment in the sense that if you are too extreme, you will get punished. If you're in business for the long term, I return to where I started, in business for the long term, you won't push that tax rate down to that extent because you will risk being criticized, and that will impact the long-term profitability of the company.
Peter.
Yeah, in our case, it's very simple. We pay the taxes where we are producing the products, and as we are producing the products where we sell them, that means that we have all our factories in the different countries, and therefore we're paying our taxes in the countries where we are producing and where we are selling. So we don't pay the taxes that we are paying in what you call banana republic, so no. We pay them where we are producing, and we are producing all over the world. In China for China, in Switzerland for Switzerland, and in the UK for the UK. So there's no issue.
Thank you. You know, I know there are so many more questions, and I'm very apologetic, but I also know that the organizers will be very cross with me if I go over the witching hour. Everyone has things to do. Let me thank the panelists. I'm not even going to try and summarize this discussion. It was extremely rich. I think we did come up with many challenges, let's say, if not problems, ethical challenges in capitalism, or whether it's the system or the people. There were some interesting ideas for solutions, and I think for me two really things stood out. One is how much is happening within companies, and two, how much we're going to rely on the millennial generation. So with that, I leave it to all of you who are in the millennial generation to improve the system as we go forward. Thank you very much.